In November in 1953, a CIA scientist checked into a hotel room in New York City. 9 days later, he was dead. The official explanation was simple. He had suffered a psychological breakdown and thrown himself from the window of his 13th floor room, a tragic suicide, a man overwhelmed by stress. Case closed. At least, that's how the story was told. But more than 20 years later, the United States government admitted something it had concealed from his family and the public. Just days before his death, that same scientist had been secretly dosed with LSD by his own colleagues as part of a classified experiment. He had not volunteered, he had not been informed, he had not given consent. And when his body was exhumed decades later, a second autopsy suggested something even more disturbing. This wasn't just a story about a suicide. It was a story about secrecy, Cold War paranoia, and a CIA program that would later become infamous under a name most people now recognize, MKUltra. This is the story of Frank Olson, and the question that has never fully gone away. Did he jump, or was he pushed? Frank Olson was not a fringe figure or a troubled outsider. He was a respected biochemist working at Fort Detrick, Maryland, one of the most secretive research facilities in the United States during the early years of the Cold War. Fort Detrick was the center of America's biological warfare program. Scientists there studied pathogens, toxins, and delivery systems designed for use in worst-case scenarios. The work was classified at the highest levels. Only a small circle of military and intelligence officials truly understood its scope. It was 1953. The Second World War had ended less than a decade earlier, but a new global tension had already taken hold. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a silent conflict defined by espionage, proxy wars, and an arms race that extended beyond nuclear weapons. Chemical agents and psychological manipulation were being explored as strategic tools. Olson worked closely with CIA officials on projects involving chemical compounds and interrogation research. Much of what he did remains classified today. Colleagues described him as intelligent and thoughtful. He was married and had 3 children. He was known to be deeply religious and, by most accounts, stable. In late November 1953, Olson attended a small CIA retreat at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. The gathering included scientists and intelligence officers. It was presented as a routine meeting, an opportunity to discuss research in an informal setting. During one of the evening sessions, CIA chemist Sidney Gottlieb added LSD to a bottle of Cointreau that Olson and others were drinking. No announcement was made. No one was warned. It was an experiment. At the time, LSD was still relatively new and poorly understood. The CIA was investigating whether the drug could be used for mind control, interrogation resistance, or psychological warfare. Officials wanted to know if it could alter perception, weaken defenses, or break down resistance. The men at Deep Creek Lake did not know they were part of what would later become one of the most infamous intelligence programs in American history. The next morning, Olson reportedly began experiencing psychological distress. He appeared anxious and unsettled, but according to later accounts, something else began to shift. Olson started questioning the morality of the work he had been involved in. He expressed doubts about certain operations. He reportedly spoke about leaving his position. In 1953, during the height of Cold War paranoia, that was not a small matter. A scientist with access to classified programs who suddenly became unstable and began expressing doubts could be viewed as a potential security risk. And within days, his life would take a dramatic turn. After the retreat, Olson's behavior concerned his superiors. He appeared withdrawn and emotionally distressed. Rather than being treated locally, he was placed under supervision. He met with CIA officials. Then, instead of being admitted to a secure military facility, he was flown to New York City for psychiatric evaluation. That decision has puzzled researchers for decades. Why New York? Why not a controlled environment near Fort Detrick? Olson checked into the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. He was assigned to room 1018A. CIA officer Robert Lashbrook accompanied him, officially to assist and monitor him. On the night of November 28, 1953, the two men were inside that hotel room. At approximately 2:30 a.m., Olson went through the closed window. The glass shattered. He fell 13 stories to the sidewalk below. He died instantly. The official ruling was suicide. According to Lashbrook's account, Olson had been depressed. He had run toward the window and jumped. Authorities accepted the explanation quickly, but several details stood out. The window had been closed and required force to open. Witnesses reported hearing the glass break, suggesting it was not already open. Lashbrook did not immediately call emergency services. Instead, he contacted a CIA superior. Police accepted the account without extensive investigation. The case was closed swiftly. But Olson's family was never told about the LSD experiment. They were told he had suffered a breakdown. They were told he had taken his own life. For more than 20 years, the truth remained concealed. Then, in 1975, the narrative began to unravel. In 1975, the U.S. Senate launched investigations into intelligence agency abuses. The hearings became known as the Church Committee. For the first time, secret CIA programs were exposed to public scrutiny. Among them was a series of covert drug experiments involving unwitting subjects. During those hearings, it emerged that a scientist had been secretly dosed with LSD shortly before his death in 1953. That scientist was Frank Olson. The government contacted Olson's family and admitted that he had been part of an experiment. President Gerald Ford personally apologized to them at the White House. A financial settlement followed. Officially, however, the death was still ruled a suicide. The apology raised more questions than it answered. If Olson had been secretly drugged, if he had expressed doubts about classified operations, if he had been under CIA supervision at the time of his death, could the situation really be reduced to a breakdown? Frank Olson's son Eric Olson believed there was more to the story. In 1994, more than 40 years after his father's death, Eric had his father's body exhumed for a second autopsy. The findings were unsettling. A forensic pathologist reported injuries consistent with blunt force trauma to the head prior to the fall. According to the examination, Olson may have been unconscious before going through the window. If that were true, the official explanation would collapse entirely. The CIA denied wrongdoing and maintained the suicide ruling. But by that point, another troubling detail had surfaced. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered the destruction of many MKUltra files. Thousands of documents were shredded. The destruction of records only deepened suspicion. Why eliminate evidence if there was nothing to hide? Fragments survived, however, revealing that MKUltra was not a single experiment, but a network of sub-projects involving drug testing, psychological manipulation, and human experimentation. Frank Olson became the most visible human face connected to that program. But he may not have been the only casualty. Officially, Frank Olson died by suicide. Officially, the CIA admitted only to dosing him with LSD without consent. Officially, the matter is considered resolved. Yet key questions remain unanswered. Why was he transported to New York instead of treated locally? Why were critical details withheld from his family for decades? Why did the second autopsy suggest prior injury? What exactly had he been working on before his death? Frank Olson's fall from a hotel window opened a door into a darker chapter of Cold War history. It revealed a period when secrecy overrode ethics, when experimentation blurred moral boundaries, and when classified programs operated beyond meaningful oversight. MKUltra was only one part of a broader landscape of covert operations, and some of its sub-projects extended far beyond laboratory walls. If one scientist connected to these programs could die under such circumstances, it raises a broader question. How many other stories remain buried in destroyed files and field archives? Because what happened to Frank Olson was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a system. And in our next investigation, we will examine one of the operations that expanded these experiments even further, beyond controlled environments and into the public sphere. MKUltra was not the beginning, and it was not the end. Some of what happened under those programs was never meant to be discovered, and some of it still hasn't been.